London, 1832. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Mayfair as carriages lined the street before St. George's Church in Hanover Square. Inside the ancient stone walls, arrangements of white roses and peonies cascaded from every pillar and windowsill, their fragrance mingling with the scent of beeswax candles that flickered in the dim sanctuary. The pews filled with London's finest families, their silk gowns rustling like autumn leaves as they settled into their seats, fans snapping open and closed in rhythmic anticipation. Catherine Eleanor Ashford stood in the vestibule, her fingers trembling as they clutched the delicate lace of her wedding bouquet. At 25, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood, content to fade into the background of society's grand tableau. Her father's gambling debts had grown like poisonous vines, choking the life from their family estate, and she had accepted her fate with the quiet dignity her mother had instilled in her before consumption claimed her life 3 years prior. The ivory silk gown that adorned her slender frame had belonged to her grandmother, altered and refreshed with Belgian lace that caught the morning light filtering through the stained glass windows. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate style, threaded with pearls that had been her mother's sole remaining jewelry. She looked every inch the radiant bride, but her heart felt like lead in her chest. Through the slightly open doors, she could hear the whispers of the congregation, sharp as daggers despite the reverent setting. The voices carried, intentionally or not, designed to wound, or at least to be overheard by the bride who waited just beyond their view. "Poor girl, sacrificed on the altar of her father's vices," murmured Lady Pemberton to her companion, her voice dripping with false sympathy that barely concealed her delight in the scandal. 25 years to his 50, can you imagine?" replied the Dowager Duchess of Hartwell, her lorgnette raised as she surveyed the assembled guests. "And he a widower these past 7 years. One wonders what he sees in such a match when he could have had any young heiress in England." "Perhaps that is precisely why," interjected Lord Ashworth with a knowing chuckle. "The young heiresses would expect affection, entertainment, position. Miss Ashford brings none of the demands of youth, having aged past the first blush of romance. She will be grateful for the roof over her head and ask no questions about where His Grace spends his evenings." Catherine's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she kept her chin high, her eyes fixed on the bouquet in her hands. This was not how she had imagined her wedding day as a girl, but then again she had long since abandoned the foolish dreams of youth. Her father stood beside her, his face haggard with drink and shame, unable to meet her eyes. The Duke of Ashbourne had paid off every debt, secured their family home from the creditors, and asked for nothing in return except Catherine's hand in marriage. It was a business transaction, pure and simple, and she would enter into it with the same pragmatism with which one might sign a contract. The organs swelled with the opening notes of the processional, and the guests rose as one, their whispers finally silenced by the gravity of the moment. Catherine took her father's arm, feeling the tremor in his hand, and together they moved toward the altar where her future awaited. Alexander Thornton, the Duke of Ashbourne, stood at the front of the church with his back straight and his hands clasped loosely before him. Even from this distance, Catherine could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines that time had etched around his eyes and mouth. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his physique that of a man who maintained an active life despite his years. His morning coat was impeccably tailored, the dark fabric emphasizing the aristocratic bearing that came from generations of breeding and privilege. As Catherine drew closer, their eyes met for the first time that day. She had expected to see indifference, perhaps a hint of masculine satisfaction at acquiring a young wife to warm his bed and manage his household. Instead, what she saw in those grey-green eyes was something that made her breath catch in her throat. There was kindness there, and a deep abiding sadness that spoke of losses she could only imagine. He watched her approach, not with the gaze of a man claiming a prize, but with the gentle regard of someone who understood the sacrifice she was making and wished perhaps that circumstances could have been different. When her father placed her hand in the Duke's, Catherine felt the warmth of his palm, the strength of his fingers as they closed carefully around hers. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, as though she were made of the finest porcelain and he feared she might shatter. The ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and circumstance befitting a duke's wedding. The bishop's voice resonated through the vaulted ceiling, intoning the sacred vows that would bind them together until death parted them. When it came time for Katherine to speak, her voice was steady and clear, betraying none of the turmoil that churned within her heart. The Duke's responses were equally measured, his deep baritone carrying a note of solemnity that suggested he took these vows as seriously as any oath sworn upon the battlefield. The ring he slipped onto her finger was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a band of gold set with diamonds and sapphires that caught the light and cast tiny rainbows across the stone floor. It was both delicate and substantial, a piece of jewelry that would have taken months to commission. The realization struck Katherine that he had planned this union far in advance, that this was not a hasty decision made in response to her father's desperate pleas. The thought should have comforted her, but instead it only deepened her confusion. Why her? Why had a duke of his standing chosen an impoverished gentlewoman past the first bloom of youth when he could have had his pick of the season's debutantes? When the bishop pronounced them man and wife, the duke leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to her cheek, his lips barely grazing her skin. It was the touch of a gentleman, proper and restrained, yet Katherine felt the warmth of it spread through her like sunlight breaking through clouds. For just a moment, as their eyes met again, she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze, something that might have been hope or perhaps longing. But it was gone before she could be certain. The wedding breakfast was held at Ashbourne House, the Duke's magnificent London residence on Grosvenor Square. The mansion was a testament to centuries of wealth and power, its facade of Portland stone gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside, the rooms had been transformed into a garden paradise, with thousands of flowers arranged in breathtaking displays that perfumed every corner. The ballroom where the guests assembled glittered with crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and marble columns that seemed to reach toward the heavens. Katherine moved through the receiving line in a daze, accepting congratulations that ranged from sincere to sardonic, always with the Duke at her side. His hand remained at the small of her back, a steady presence that anchored her to the moment and kept her from drifting away into the protective numbness she had cultivated over the past months. She noticed how he deflected the more cutting remarks with practiced ease, his aristocratic reserve serving as both shield and sword as he navigated the treacherous waters of high society. The wedding breakfast itself was a sumptuous affair, with courses that seemed to go on forever. There were oysters on beds of ice, consommé served in delicate porcelain, salmon poached to perfection, roasted game birds, and puddings that defied description. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions, and Katherine found herself grateful for the Duke's presence beside her at the head table. He seemed to sense when she was overwhelmed, leaning in to make quiet observations that were surprisingly witty, coaxing reluctant smiles from her, despite her determination to remain aloof. As the afternoon wore into evening and the guests departed in their carriages, Katherine found herself alone with her husband in the grand entrance hall. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken expectations and mutual uncertainty. She waited for him to assert his marital rights, to lead her upstairs to the chambers that had been prepared for them, but instead he turned to her with that same gentle expression she had seen in the church. "You must be exhausted," he said, his voice low and kind. "It has been a long day, and I imagine you would welcome some time to yourself. Your apartments are ready, and I have instructed the staff to attend to your every need. We will dine together tomorrow evening, if that is agreeable to you, but tonight you should rest and become acquainted with your new home." Katherine stared at him, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. Every married woman of her acquaintance had warned her about the wedding night, about the duties she would be expected to perform, about the pain and indignity she must endure for the sake of providing an heir. Yet here was her husband, offering her solitude and rest as though he truly cared about her comfort above his own desires. "I don't understand," she whispered, searching his face for signs of mockery or some hidden agenda. "Surely you expect—" "I expect nothing from you that you are not ready to give freely," he interrupted gently, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "We are bound by law and custom, Katherine, but I will not force myself upon you like some barbarian. You will come to me when and if you choose, and until that time I am content to wait. You have my word as a gentleman and as your husband that your person is inviolate. No one, not even I, will enter your chambers without your express permission." The tears that had threatened all day finally spilled down her cheeks, and she was mortified to be showing such weakness before this man who was still a stranger to her. But he simply offered her his handkerchief, fine linen embroidered with his monogram, and waited patiently while she composed herself. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion she could not name. "Alexander," he corrected softly. "When we are alone, I hope you will call me Alexander. And I shall call you Katherine, if I may." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and he smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face, erasing years from his features and giving her a glimpse of the young man he must have been before life had carved its sorrows into his countenance. Mrs. Thornbury, the housekeeper, appeared as though summoned by some invisible signal, and the Duke entrusted Katherine to her care. As she followed the older woman up the sweeping staircase, Katherine turned back once to see him still standing in the entrance hall, watching her ascend with an expression that she would puzzle over for hours to come. It was not desire she saw there, nor satisfaction at having secured a young wife. Instead, it was something closer to reverence, as though he found her infinitely precious and was determined to prove himself worthy of the trust she had not yet learned to give. Her apartments were beyond anything she could have imagined. The bedroom was decorated in shades of cream and rose, with silk wallpaper that seemed to glow in the lamplight. The furniture was delicate and feminine without being childish, each piece clearly chosen with care. There was a sitting room adjoining the bedroom, lined with bookshelves that held volumes in English, French, and Italian. A writing desk sat before the window, positioned to catch the morning light, and Katherine noticed that it was stocked with fine paper, pens, and ink in several colours. "His Grace had the rooms entirely refurnished for you, my lady," Mrs. Thornbury said with evident pride. "He spent hours consulting with the decorators, insisting that everything be perfect. The books were selected based on titles he remembered you mentioning during your brief courtship, and he asked that fresh flowers be brought in daily from the hothouse." Katherine ran her fingers over the spines of the books, recognizing favourites from her youth that she had mentioned only once in passing, during one of the Duke's formal calls to her father's house. The fact that he had remembered such a trivial detail and acted upon it touched something deep within her, a place she had thought sealed away forever. That night, she lay in a bed so soft it felt like floating on clouds, staring at the canopy above her and trying to make sense of the man she had married. Everything she had been told about the Duke of Ashbourne painted him as a cold, ambitious aristocrat who had buried one wife and now sought another to warm his bed and bear him an heir. The reality was proving to be far more complex than the gossip had suggested, and Katherine found herself intrigued despite her determination to guard her heart. The following weeks established a pattern that both comforted and confused Katherine. Each morning, a maid would bring her breakfast on a silver tray along with fresh flowers and a note from the Duke. The notes were never effusive or demanding. Instead, they were gentle observations about the weather, mentions of books he thought she might enjoy, or simple wishes for her to have a pleasant day. He made no demands on her time, yet he always seemed to be there when she needed him, appearing in doorways or gardens with that same quiet consideration that had marked their wedding day. They dined together each evening in the smaller dining room that overlooked the gardens, and Katherine began to look forward to these hours when they would talk about everything and nothing. The Duke was remarkably well read, with opinions on literature and philosophy that challenged her own and made her think in new ways. He asked her about her interests, her dreams for the future, her opinions on matters of politics and society that most men would never discuss with their wives. He listened when she spoke, really listened, as though her words were precious gifts he was privileged to receive. She learned that he rose early each morning to ride in Hyde Park, that he was deeply involved in charitable works that helped the poor of London, that he corresponded with scholars across Europe, and was considered something of an expert on ancient history. She discovered that his first marriage had been arranged when he was barely 20, that his wife had been delicate and often ill, and that her death in childbirth had devastated him in ways he was only now beginning to recover from. "I failed her," he told Katherine one evening as they sat in the library, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. I was too young, too focused on my own pursuits to see that she was suffering. By the time I understood how deep her melancholy ran, it was too late. She wanted a child so desperately, thought it would fill the emptiness inside her, but carrying him only made her weaker. They both died in my arms, and I swore I would never be so careless with another person's heart again. Katherine felt her own heart constrict at the pain in his voice. "You cannot blame yourself for her death," she said softly. "Childbirth is dangerous, and melancholy is an illness like any other. You did not cause these things." "Perhaps not," he agreed, his eyes meeting hers across the space between their chairs. "But I could have been more attentive, more aware of her needs. I could have loved her better, been the husband she deserved, instead of the distant figure I became. When I decided to marry again, I made a promise to myself that I would not repeat those mistakes. Whoever my wife might be, I would cherish her, protect her, and never take her presence in my life for granted." The intensity of his gaze made Katherine's breath catch, and she found herself unable to look away. "Is that why you married me?" she asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. "Because you felt you owed some debt to a ghost." "I married you," he said slowly, rising from his chair and crossing to kneel beside hers, "because from the moment I met you, I saw a woman of remarkable strength and grace. You bore your father's failures with dignity, faced society's censure with your head held high, and never once complained about the unfairness of your circumstances. You were kind to servants, patient with children, and when you smiled, the whole room seemed to brighten. I saw in you not a convenient wife, but a woman worthy of devotion, and I hoped that perhaps in time you might come to see me as more than merely the man who saved your family from ruin." Katherine's hands trembled in her lap as she processed his words. "I thought you married me because I was desperate and would ask nothing of you," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was convenient, undemanding, a wife who would fade into the background and let you live your life as you pleased." His hand covered hers, warm and solid and real. "Then we have both labored under false assumptions," he said with a rueful smile. "I hope, Katherine, that we might begin anew, not as strangers bound by obligation, but as two people who have the opportunity to build something real together. I make no demands and set no timeline. I ask only that you give us a chance, that you allow yourself to see me as I truly am and judge me accordingly." The barriers Katherine had erected around her heart began to crack, tiny fissures that let in light she had not realized she was starving for. She turned her hand beneath his, palm to palm, and felt his fingers interlock with hers. It was such a simple gesture, yet it felt momentous, a first step towards something she was only beginning to understand. The seasons changed, and with them, Katherine began to change as well. The Duke introduced her to his friends, men and women of intelligence and wit, who welcomed her into their circle without the judgment she had expected. She discovered that her husband's reputation among those who truly knew him was that of a man of honor and compassion, someone who used his wealth and position to effect genuine good in the world. She accompanied him on his charitable visits, expecting to be relegated to the role of decorative observer. Instead, he consulted with her, valued her opinions, and implemented her suggestions with an enthusiasm that made it clear he saw her as a true partner. Together they established a school for poor children, funded a hospital wing for women's ailments, and supported artists whose work might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Katherine found herself falling into the rhythm of their life together, the easy companionship that had developed between them. She caught herself watching him when he was unaware, admiring the way the lamplight caught in his hair, the strength in his hands as he handled his correspondence, the kindness in his eyes when he spoke with the servants. The age difference that had seemed so insurmountable on their wedding day had become irrelevant. What did years matter when measured against compatibility of mind and spirit? One evening in late autumn, as they walked through the gardens at Ashbourne Manor, the Duke's country estate, Katherine realized that the constant ache of loneliness that had been her companion for so long had disappeared. In its place was a warmth, a contentment that suffused her days with quiet joy. She glanced at the man beside her, his coat collar turned up against the evening chill, and felt a rush of affection so strong it nearly took her breath away. "Are you cold?" he asked immediately, noticing her sudden stillness. "We should go inside. I don't want you to catch a chill." "I'm not cold," she said. And then, before her courage could fail her, she reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Alexander, I need to tell you something." He went very still, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about our arrangement," she began, choosing her words carefully. "About the agreement we made on our wedding night." She saw the flash of something like pain cross his features, quickly masked, and realized he had misunderstood her meaning. "Katherine, if you wish for separate households, or if there is some way I have failed you, please tell me. I will do whatever is in my power to make you happy, even if that means—" "No," she interrupted, her hand moving from his jaw to press against his lips, silencing him. "You misunderstand me. I don't want separate households. I want the opposite. I want to be your wife in truth, Alexander, not because it is my duty or because I am grateful for what you have done for my family, but because somewhere along the way, when I wasn't paying attention, I fell in love with you." The world seemed to hold its breath as her words hung in the air between them. Then slowly, wonder dawned in his eyes, followed by joy so profound it made him look decades younger. His arms came around her, gentle but sure, pulling her close against his chest. "Katherine," he breathed her name like a prayer, his forehead resting against hers. "I have loved you since before I knew your name. I saw you at a garden party 2 years ago, before your father's troubles became public knowledge, before you knew that I existed. You were reading under a tree, completely absorbed in your book, and I thought I had never seen anyone so perfectly at peace. I made inquiries, learned everything I could about you, and when I heard of your father's debts, I saw not an opportunity but a chance to offer help without the appearance of charity. I never imagined that you might come to care for me in return. I thought I would spend my life grateful for whatever small part of your attention you chose to give me." "You ridiculous man," she said, laughing through tears she didn't remember shedding. "You have all of my attention, all of my heart, and I am the one who is grateful. You could have demanded everything and given nothing, but instead you gave me time, gave me space, gave me the freedom to discover my own feelings. You treated me with a respect and care that I had never known, and in doing so you made it impossible for me not to love you." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the chaste peck on the cheek they had shared at their wedding. This was the kiss of a man who had waited months for permission, who had disciplined himself to patience, and was now being rewarded beyond his wildest dreams. Katherine felt herself respond with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing close to his as years of loneliness and longing found their release in this moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and slightly dazed, Katherine saw that the sky had darkened, stars beginning to appear overhead. "Take me inside," she whispered, and the words held all the invitation he had been waiting for since the day they exchanged vows. Their wedding night, delayed by months of patient courtship and careful building of trust, was everything Katherine had not dared to hope for. Alexander proved to be a considerate lover, attentive to her needs, patient with her inexperience, and deeply moved by the gift of her trust. She discovered that physical intimacy, when shared between two people who truly cared for one another, was not the frightening ordeal she had been warned about, but rather a profound form of communication that left her feeling cherished and complete. In the months that followed, their love deepened and matured, growing stronger with each passing day. Katherine learned the geography of her husband's body and heart, discovering the places where old wounds still ached and applying the balm of her affection. She made him laugh with her wry observations, challenged him with her quick intelligence, and supported him through the inevitable difficulties that came with managing a vast estate and navigating the treacherous waters of politics and society. For his part, Alexander proved himself to be everything Katherine had not known she needed. He encouraged her to pursue her own interests, supporting her when she expressed a desire to write, arranging introductions with publishers when her first attempts at essays showed promise. He consulted with her on important decisions, treating her not as a subordinate but as a true partner whose opinions he valued and respected. They were not without their disagreements, of course. Catherine's independent streak sometimes chafed against the restrictions society placed on married women, and Alexander's protective instincts occasionally verged on overprotective. But they learned to navigate these moments with humor and honesty, talking through their differences rather than letting resentment fester. A year after their wedding, Katherine discovered she was with child. The news filled her with joy, tinged with fear, knowing what had happened to Alexander's first wife. But her husband was there immediately, kneeling before her chair and taking her hands in his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will not lose you," he said fiercely. "I will hire the best doctors in England, and we will take every precaution. If you wish it, we can go to the country, away from the pressures of London society. Whatever you need, whatever will keep you safe, you have only to ask." "What I need," Katherine said, bringing his hands to her lips, "is for you to trust that I am strong enough for this. I am not her, Alexander. I am not fragile or given to melancholy. I want this child, want to give you the family you have longed for, and I refuse to spend the next months wrapped in cotton wool as though I am made of glass." He struggled visibly with his fear, but in the end, his trust in her won out. "Very well," he agreed, "but you will promise me that you will rest when you are tired, that you will tell me immediately if something feels wrong, and that you will let me fuss over you at least a little bit." "I suppose I can allow some fussing," she said with a smile, pulling him up to sit beside her. "After all, it is rather endearing when you go all protective and concerned." "Endearing," he repeated with a snort, but his arm came around her shoulders, and she felt him relax against her. "I will show you endearing, my love." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, much to Alexander's visible relief and Katherine's satisfaction. She continued with her charitable work and her writing, though she did consent to reducing her schedule as her body changed. The Duke was almost comically attentive, anticipating her needs before she could voice them, reading to her in the evenings, and rubbing her feet when they ached from carrying the extra weight. Their son was born on a spring morning, his lusty cries announcing his arrival to a household that had been holding its collective breath. Katherine endured the ordeal with a strength that made the midwife declare she had never seen an easier birth, though Alexander, who had insisted on being allowed in the room despite propriety's dictates, looked ready to faint from anxiety. When the midwife placed the baby in Katherine's arms, and Alexander knelt beside the bed to gaze down at their son, Katherine saw tears streaming down her husband's face. "Thank you," he whispered, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Thank you for being strong, for surviving, for giving me this gift I thought I would never have." "You gave me so much more," Katherine replied, cradling their child with one arm, while her free hand cupped Alexander's face. "You gave me love when I expected only duty, partnership when I expected subordination, joy when I expected mere contentment. Our son is just the beginning of everything we will build together." They named him James Alexander, for Katherine's late grandfather and his father, and he proved to be a child of strong lungs and stronger will. The Duke proved himself to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, spending hours in the nursery when he should have been attending to business, making ridiculous faces to elicit his son's gummy smiles. 2 years later, a daughter followed, and then another son 3 years after that. The house that had seemed so grand and empty when Katherine first entered it as a bride became filled with the sounds of children's laughter, of running feet on marble stairs, of life in all its chaotic glory. Katherine stood at the window of her sitting room one afternoon, watching Alexander in the garden below with their children. The oldest, James, now 7, was attempting to teach his father some complex game that seemed to involve a great deal of running and shouting. Little Amelia, 5 years old, sat on Alexander's shoulders, her small hands tangled in his silver-streaked hair as she directed him where to go. The baby, Edmund, barely 2, toddled after them all on sturdy legs, determined not to be left behind. It had been 8 years since that fateful wedding day when she had walked down the aisle expecting a life of polite distance and resigned duty. Looking at her family now, Katherine could hardly recognize the frightened woman she had been. In her place stood someone confident, loved, and utterly content with the life she had found where she least expected it. Mrs. Thornbury appeared in the doorway, a knowing smile on her face as she followed Katherine's gaze. "His Grace is covered in grass stains again," she observed with mock disapproval. "That's the third time this week I've had to treat his coat." "Let him be," Katherine said with a laugh. "He's happy, they're happy, and grass stains are a small price to pay for such joy." "You've been good for him, my lady," the housekeeper said, her voice softening. "When he brought you here that first day, he was so afraid you would never learn to be happy. He told me that all he wanted was to give you a comfortable life, that he didn't dare hope for anything more. And look at you both now." Katherine turned from the window, surprised to feel tears pricking at her eyes. "He gave me everything, Mrs. Thornbury. Not just comfort and security, but real partnership, true love. He saw me not as a burden or an obligation, but as someone worth waiting for, worth cherishing. How could I not love a man like that?" Later that evening, after the children had been bathed and put to bed with the usual negotiations and delays, Katherine and Alexander sat together in the library. She was curled against his side on the sofa, his arm around her shoulders, both of them pleasantly tired from a day well lived. "Do you remember our wedding day?" Katherine asked suddenly, looking up at him. "When you told me you would wait until I was ready, that you would not force me to be a wife to you in truth?" "I remember every moment of that day," Alexander replied, his fingers playing with a strand of her hair. "I remember thinking I was the luckiest man in England, even if you never came to care for me. Just having you in my life, in whatever capacity you chose, seemed like more than I deserved. I think about how afraid I was," Katherine continued, "how certain I was that I had been sold to a man who would use me and discard me. And then you gave me that handkerchief when I cried, and you offered me time instead of demands, and you started those little notes every morning. Do you still have the list?" He looked puzzled. "What list?" "The list of my interests that you kept, the one you used to fill my bookshelves and choose topics of conversation. Don't think I didn't notice how artfully you drew me out, how carefully you created opportunities for me to share my thoughts without feeling judged." A slow flush crept up his neck, and Katherine was charmed to see him actually look embarrassed. "There may have been some notes," he admitted. "I wanted to know everything about you, wanted to prove that I saw you as a person, not just a wife. Was it very obvious?" "It was perfect," Katherine corrected, reaching up to kiss him. "It was exactly what I needed. You gave me the space to discover my own feelings, to come to you freely rather than out of obligation, and in doing so, you made it possible for me to love you with my whole heart, not just accept you as a necessity." "I would do it all again," Alexander said seriously. "Wait 10 years if that's what you needed. I have never regretted a single moment of patience, never wished I had pushed you to accept me sooner. What we have built together is worth any amount of waiting, any sacrifice I might have made." Katherine settled more comfortably against him, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "I used to wonder why you chose me," she confessed. "I spent months trying to understand what you saw in a penniless woman past her first youth, with nothing to recommend her but a decent education and a desperate father." "I saw a woman reading under a tree," Alexander replied quietly. "I saw grace under pressure, kindness in adversity, intelligence sparkling in every conversation we shared. I saw someone who had been denied the life she deserved by circumstances beyond her control, and I wanted to give you the world. The fact that you have given me infinitely more in return is a blessing I thank heaven for every day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, a late spring rain began to fall, pattering softly against the windows. The fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere in the house one of the children called out in their sleep before settling back into dreams. "I'm glad my father had debts," Katherine said suddenly, and then laughed at Alexander's shocked expression. "I know that sounds terrible, but it's true. If he hadn't gambled away our fortune, if our family hadn't faced ruin, I would never have met you. I would have married some appropriate gentleman of limited means, lived a perfectly respectable life, and never known what it felt like to be truly, deeply loved. The scandal and hardship that seemed like the end of my world turned out to be the beginning of everything I never knew I wanted." Alexander turned to look at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Do you know how long I have waited to hear you say something like that? Not because I'm glad for your suffering, but because I needed to know that you saw our marriage as a blessing rather than merely the best of bad options." "You ridiculous man," Katherine said again, the endearment that had become her favorite over the years. "When will you understand that you are not merely the best option, not just a comfortable alternative? You are everything. You are my love, my partner, my dearest friend, and the father of my children. You are the man I choose every day, not because I have to, but because I cannot imagine my life without you." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Katherine felt the familiar warmth spread through her body. Even after 8 years of marriage, his touch still had the power to make her breath catch, to make her feel desired and cherished in equal measure. "Come upstairs with me," he murmured against her lips, and she laughed, low and intimate, a sound that belonged only to these private moments between them. "Such shocking behavior, Your Grace," she teased, even as she rose from the sofa and took his offered hand. "What would society say?" "Let society say what it wishes," Alexander replied, leading her toward the stairs. "They predicted we would be miserable together, that our age difference would breed resentment, that a marriage based on practical necessity could never become more. They were wrong about everything, and I find I don't care what they think anymore." As they climbed the stairs together, Katherine reflected on the truth of his words. Society had indeed been wrong about them, spectacularly so. The whispers that had followed their wedding had eventually faded, replaced by reluctant admiration for what the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne had built together. Their partnership had become something of a legend among those who knew them well, proof that love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances. The years continued to unfold like the pages of a beloved book, each chapter bringing new challenges and joys. Katherine's writing career flourished, her essays on social reform and women's education gaining recognition throughout England and beyond. Alexander supported her endeavours wholeheartedly, proud to introduce his wife as an author and thinker, never once suggesting that her pursuits were unseemly for a duchess. Their children grew strong and healthy, each inheriting different aspects of their parents' personalities. James had his father's serious demeanour and love of history, often found in the library poring over ancient texts. Amelia possessed her mother's quick wit and independent spirit, already showing signs that she would challenge society's expectations at every turn. Young Edmund was a perfect blend of both, adventurous yet thoughtful, equally comfortable in the stables and the schoolroom. On their 10th anniversary, Alexander planned an elaborate celebration that took Katherine completely by surprise. She had assumed they would mark the occasion with a quiet dinner at home, perhaps exchange gifts in the privacy of their chambers. Instead, he had arranged to recreate their wedding day, but this time with joy instead of trepidation. They returned to St. George's Church in Hanover Square on a morning very similar to the one a decade before. But this time when Katherine walked down the aisle, it was not on her father's arm, but on the arms of their 3 children, all dressed in their finest. The pews were filled not with gossiping society matrons, but with the friends they had made together, the people whose lives they had touched through their charitable work, the servants who had become like family. Alexander stood at the altar in the same mourning coat he had worn 10 years prior, carefully preserved for this occasion. When Katherine reached him, he took both her hands in his, and the bishop who had married them the first time spoke words of renewal and recommitment. 10 years ago, Alexander said when it was time for him to speak, his voice carrying through the church, "I stood in this place and promised to honor and cherish you. I promised to be faithful and true, to comfort you in sickness and in health." Those were not empty vows, Katherine. They were the foundation upon which I have built my life. Every morning when I wake beside you, every evening when we talk over dinner, every moment watching you with our children, I recommit myself to those promises. You have made me a better man than I ever thought I could be, and I spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of the gift of your love. Katherine's vision blurred with tears, but they were tears of pure happiness. When it was her turn, she spoke from her heart. 10 years ago I stood here in fear, certain that I was trading my freedom for security. I was so wrong, Alexander. You did not take my freedom. You gave me wings. You did not cage me with expectations. You freed me with your trust. I love you not because I must, not because you saved my family or gave me a home, but because you saw me when I felt invisible, valued me when I felt worthless, and waited patiently while I learned to open my heart. You are my great love, my unexpected joy, and I thank God every day for the debts that brought us together." There was not a dry eye in the church, and when they kissed this time, their children cheered, joined by the congregation in a spontaneous outburst of celebration that would have scandalized the proper society folks who had attended their first wedding. The celebration afterward was held again at Ashbourne House, but the atmosphere could not have been more different from that first wedding breakfast. There was no stiff formality, no cutting remarks hidden behind false smiles. Instead, there was laughter and dancing, children running through the gardens, and music that lasted until the stars came out. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Katherine found herself once again standing in the entrance hall with her husband. This time, however, there was no awkward silence, no uncertainty about what would happen next. Alexander pulled her close, and she went willingly into his arms, resting her head against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for today, for every day, for being exactly who you are." "The pleasure has been entirely mine," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I hope you know this is just the beginning. We have many more decades ahead of us, God willing, and I intend to spend every one of them showing you how much you mean to me." "Only decades," Katherine teased, looking up at him with sparkling eyes. "I was rather hoping for eternity." "Eternity it is, then," Alexander agreed solemnly, though his eyes danced with humor. "I'll make the necessary arrangements." As they climbed the stairs that night, their hands clasped together, Katherine thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She remembered the frightened bride who had ascended these same stairs 10 years ago, convinced that her life was over before it had truly begun. She thought about the patient man who had given her time and space, who had courted her after their wedding rather than before, who had shown her through actions rather than words what love could be. The years had etched a few more lines around Alexander's eyes, silvered more of his hair, but to Katherine he had never been more handsome. The physical signs of aging were nothing compared to the depth of character that shone through, the kindness that had only grown with time, the passion that still burned as brightly as it had on the night she first invited him into her bed. Their life together was not without its challenges. There were difficult decisions to make regarding the estate, worries about the children's futures, the inevitable losses that came with time. Katherine's father passed away 3 years after their wedding, his health broken by years of excess. Alexander's sister fell ill with the same consumption that had taken Katherine's mother, and they nursed her through her final months. There were financial setbacks, political upheavals, and the 1,000 small crises that make up any life. But through it all, they faced everything together. When Katherine was discouraged by the slow progress of her reform efforts, Alexander was there to remind her of the lives they had changed, the children who were receiving educations because of her persistence. When Alexander struggled with the weight of his responsibilities, Katherine helped him see that he did not have to carry every burden alone, that asking for help was not weakness, but wisdom. They learned each other's rhythms, the unspoken language that develops between two people who have truly become one. Katherine could tell by the set of Alexander's shoulders when he was worried about something, and she knew exactly how to coax him into sharing his concerns. Alexander could read Katherine's moods in the tone of her voice, knew when she needed solitude and when she needed company, when she wanted advice and when she simply needed him to listen. Their children watched and learned, absorbing the lessons of mutual respect and genuine affection. James grew up understanding that a man showed his strength not through dominance, but through service, that true power lay in lifting others up rather than keeping them down. Amelia learned that a woman's worth was not determined by her beauty or her compliance, but by her character and her contributions. Edmund, the baby of the family, grew up in a home where love was demonstrated daily, where his parents held hands at the dinner table and stole kisses when they thought no one was watching. On Katherine's 35th birthday, Alexander surprised her with a gift that made her cry harder than she had at their renewal of vows. It was a book, leather-bound and beautifully printed, with her name embossed in gold on the cover. Inside were all her published essays, collected and organized chronologically, along with several pieces she had written but never published. "You said once that you wished your work might outlive you, that you hoped to leave something meaningful behind," Alexander explained as she turned the pages with trembling hands. "I wanted you to see what I see when I look at your body of work. You have changed minds, Katherine. You have opened doors for other women, given voice to those who had none. This collection is just the beginning. Your words will echo through the decades, inspiring generations yet unborn." "How did you get the unpublished pieces?" she asked, recognizing essays she had abandoned as unworthy. "I may have conspired with your secretary," he admitted with a sheepish grin, "and I may have taken the liberty of having them edited and prepared for publication with the rest. I hope you're not angry." "Angry?" Katherine laughed through her tears. "I'm overwhelmed. This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." "Well, you set rather a high standard yourself," Alexander pointed out. "May I remind you of the year you commissioned an entire expedition to Egypt to recover specific artifacts for my collection? Or the time you secretly learned ancient Greek so you could read Homer to me in the original? Those were nothing," Katherine protested. "This is my legacy, my contribution to the world, and you've treated it as though it matters as much as any duke's accomplishments." "It matters more," Alexander said seriously. "Dukedoms are accidents of birth. What you have built with your mind and your pen, that is real achievement. And yes, it matters to me every bit as much as it matters to you, because you matter to me more than anything else in this world." These moments of tenderness punctuated their days, small affirmations that their love was not simply enduring, but continuing to grow. Katherine found that her feelings for Alexander had evolved over the years, deepening in ways she couldn't have imagined on their wedding day. The initial attraction had matured into something richer and more complex, a love that encompassed passion and friendship, respect and desire, comfort and excitement. She loved the way he still opened doors for her after all these years, the way he stood when she entered a room, the way he asked her opinion before making major decisions. She loved his patience with their children, his dedication to his tenants' welfare, his willingness to admit when he was wrong. She loved the silver in his hair and the laugh lines around his eyes, visible proof of years spent in joy rather than sorrow. For his part, Alexander never ceased to marvel at the woman his wife had become. The timid bride who had walked down the aisle 10 years ago had blossomed into a force of nature, confident and accomplished while remaining kind and compassionate. He loved her fierce intelligence, the way she challenged him to think differently about the world. He loved her laugh, bright and uninhibited, so different from the careful, controlled sound she had made in those early months. He loved the way she looked at him across a crowded room, her eyes holding promises for later when they were alone. Their physical relationship had also evolved, growing more passionate and adventurous as Katherine shed the last vestiges of her fear and inhibition. They had learned each other's bodies as thoroughly as they had learned each other's minds, discovering what gave pleasure and what brought them to the heights of shared ecstasy. There was playfulness in their lovemaking now, a comfort with each other that allowed for both tenderness and intensity. One night, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath of passion, Katherine propped herself up on one elbow to look down at her husband. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Waiting so long, giving me so much time. You could have had everything you wanted on our wedding night." Alexander reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "If I had taken what you were not ready to give, I would have had your body but never your heart. What we share now is infinitely more precious than anything I might have gained through impatience. No, my love, I have never regretted giving you time. Every moment of waiting was an investment in our future, and the returns have exceeded my wildest expectations." "You're a remarkable man, Alexander Thornton," Katherine said softly. "Sometimes I wonder what I did to deserve you." "You existed," he replied simply. "You were yourself, genuine and strong and beautiful, and you allowed me the privilege of loving you. That is all I ever needed, all I will ever need." As the years continued to pass, their love story became the standard by which others in their circle measured their own marriages. Young couples starting out would ask them for advice, seeking the secret to their obvious happiness. Katherine and Alexander would exchange amused glances before offering their wisdom. "Talk to each other," Katherine would say. "Really talk, not just about household matters or social obligations, but about your dreams, your fears, your thoughts. Don't let resentments fester or assumptions go unchallenged." And listen when your partner speaks, Alexander would add, not just waiting for your turn to talk, but truly hearing what they're saying, what they're feeling. Your spouse should be your closest confidant, the person who knows you better than anyone else. Respect comes before love, Katherine would continue. If you don't respect your partner's mind, their opinions, their autonomy, then whatever affection you feel will eventually curdle into contempt. But also remember, Alexander would finish with a smile at his wife, that love is not just a feeling, but a choice you make every day. Choose to be patient, choose to be kind, choose to see the best in each other even when it's difficult. Those choices, made consistently over time, build something unbreakable. Their own children, now growing into young adults, had front-row seats to the truth of these lessons. They saw their parents navigate disagreements with respect and humor, saw them support each other's endeavors without jealousy or resentment, saw them steal moments of affection throughout even the busiest days. James, now 17 and preparing to attend Cambridge, told his father one day that he hoped to find a marriage like his parents someday. "I used to think all marriages were like yours," he confessed, "but then I spent time with my friends' families, and I realized how rare what you and Mother have actually is. Most couples seem to merely tolerate each other, or worse, they're actively unhappy. But you two genuinely enjoy being together." "We do," Alexander confirmed, clasping his son's shoulder. "But I want you to understand that what your mother and I have didn't happen by accident. It required patience, communication, and daily effort. There have been difficult times, moments when we frustrated each other or wanted different things. The difference is that we chose to work through those moments rather than let them drive us apart." "How did you know Mother was the one?" James asked. "When did you realize you loved her?" Alexander smiled, his eyes taking on a distant look as he remembered. "I knew I wanted her from the moment I saw her, years before we married. But love? Real love? That came gradually, built through shared experiences and deepened understanding. Though I will say, the moment I knew beyond any doubt was about 6 months after our wedding. We were arguing about something trivial, I can't even remember what now, and in the middle of it, she started laughing. Just burst out laughing because she realized how ridiculous we were being. And I thought, this is the woman I want to argue with for the rest of my life. Because even in conflict, she brought joy and perspective. That's when I knew I wasn't just infatuated, but truly deeply in love. These conversations, passed down from one generation to the next, ensured that the legacy of their love would extend far beyond their own lifetimes. Their children would carry these lessons into their own marriages and their children's children after them, creating a ripple effect that would touch countless lives. As Katherine and Alexander entered their 50s, they found themselves becoming grandparents. James married a brilliant young woman he met at university, and within a year they welcomed a daughter. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Katherine was struck by the continuity of life, the way love perpetuated itself through the generations. "She has your eyes," Alexander observed, standing beside Katherine as she cradled the baby. "And your stubborn chin," Katherine countered with a laugh. "This poor child doesn't stand a chance." They had reached an age where they could look back on their lives with satisfaction, knowing that they had built something meaningful together. Their marriage had produced not just children, but positive change in the world around them. The school they had founded now educated hundreds of children. The hospital wing they had funded had saved countless lives. Katherine's published works had influenced policy debates and changed social attitudes. But more than these tangible achievements, they had created a partnership that served as a model for what marriage could be at its best. They had proven that love could grow from the most unpromising beginnings, that patience and respect could transform obligation into joy, that two people committed to each other's happiness could build something beautiful even when the whole world predicted their failure. On their 20th anniversary, they returned once more to St. George's Church, this time with their children and grandchildren in attendance. It had become a tradition, these decennial celebrations of their union, and the church had become familiar with the unusual practice of the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne. Standing at the altar for the third time, Katherine looked at the man beside her and saw not just her husband but her entire life's journey reflected in his face. The years had marked him as they had marked her, but they had marked them together. Every line, every grey hair, every subtle change was a shared experience, a memory they both carried. 20 years, Alexander said when it was his turn to speak. 2 decades since a frightened young woman walked down this aisle expecting a prison sentence, and instead found her home. Katherine, you have been my partner, my lover, my dearest friend, and my greatest adventure. You have challenged me, changed me, and made me infinitely better than I was. I love you today more than I did yesterday, and I will love you even more tomorrow. That is my promise, renewed today, as it has been renewed every day of our marriage. Katherine's own vows were equally heartfelt. I came to you with nothing, and you gave me everything. Not money or position, though those came with the marriage, but respect, trust, and unconditional love. You saw me when I felt invisible, valued me when I felt worthless, and loved me before I knew how to love you back. These 20 years have been the greatest gift of my life, and I would choose you again every single time in every lifetime. You are my heart, Alexander, and you always will be. The celebration that followed was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the couple. There were former students from their school, patients from their hospital, fellow reformers who had worked alongside Katherine, and countless others who considered the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne friends and benefactors. As the evening drew to a close and they stood together watching their guests depart, Katherine leaned against her husband with a contented sigh. "Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding night?" she asked. "That you would wait for me to come to you, that you expected nothing I wasn't ready to give?" "I remember every word I've ever spoken to you," Alexander replied. "Why do you ask?" "Because I want you to know that the wait was worth it," Katherine said, turning to face him fully. "For both of us. If you had rushed me, if you had demanded rather than courted, I would have given you compliance, but never love. By giving me time, you gave me the space to discover that you were everything I never knew I needed. Thank you for your patience, your kindness, and your unwavering faith that we could become something wonderful." "The faith was never in question," Alexander said, drawing her close. "From the moment I saw you, I knew that you were extraordinary. All I ever wanted was the chance to prove myself worthy of you, and you've given me 20 years to make my case. I hope I've succeeded." "You've exceeded every expectation," Katherine assured him. "You've been everything a husband should be and more. You've been my advocate, my supporter, my challenger, and my comfort. You've given me freedom and security, passion and friendship, excitement and peace. You are everything, Alexander, and I love you more than words can express." They stood there in the entrance hall of Ashbourne House, in the same spot where they had stood awkwardly 20 years before, unsure of what the future held. But now there was no uncertainty, no fear, only the deep contentment that came from 2 lives fully intertwined, 2 hearts beating as one. As they climbed the stairs together that night, their hands clasped and their steps in perfect synchronization, Katherine reflected on the incredible journey they had shared. She thought about the terrified bride she had been, certain that she was being sacrificed to save her family. She thought about the patient man who had seen beyond her fear to the woman she could become with the right support and encouragement. She thought about the love that had grown between them, slowly at first and then with increasing intensity, until it had become the foundation of everything they built together. Their story was not one of love at first sight or instant passion. It was something deeper and more enduring, a love that had been constructed carefully, brick by brick, through thousands of small kindnesses and daily choices. It was the kind of love that weathered storms, because it had been built on solid ground, that grew stronger with time because it was continually tended and nurtured. Years continued to pass, each one adding new chapters to their story. They weathered the marriage of all 3 children, the births of more grandchildren, the inevitable losses that came with age. Alexander's health began to falter in his late 60s, nothing dramatic but the slow decline that comes with advancing years. Katherine nursed him through each setback with the same devotion he had shown her, their roles reversing as she became his primary caretaker. On their 30th anniversary, Alexander was too weak to return to St. George's Church, so the bishop came to them, conducting a small ceremony in the gardens of Ashbourne Manor. Surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and a few close friends, they renewed their vows one final time. Alexander's voice was softer now, affected by the illness that was slowly claiming him, but his words were as powerful as ever. 30 years ago, I married a woman who I hoped might learn to tolerate me, he said, his hand trembling slightly as it held Catherine's. Instead, I found the love of my life, the partner of my soul, and the reason for my existence. Every breath I have taken since that day has been sweeter because you were there to share it. I have loved you for 30 years, Katherine, and I will love you for whatever time remains to me and beyond into whatever comes after. Catherine's tears fell freely as she spoke her own vows. You gave me time when I needed space, love when I thought I would have only duty, and a life beyond my wildest imaginings. You have been my rock, my joy, my everything. These 30 years have been the greatest blessing of my life, and I will carry the memory of your love with me always, wherever our paths may lead. 3 months later, on a quiet autumn morning with Katherine holding his hand, Alexander passed peacefully in his sleep. He was 77 years old, and he had lived to see all his children settled and happy, had held a dozen grandchildren in his arms, and had spent 3 decades with the woman he loved beyond measure. Katherine mourned him deeply, as did everyone who had known him. The funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the lives he had touched and the love he had inspired. But even in her grief, Katherine found comfort in the certainty that they had made the most of every day they had been given, that there were no words left unspoken, no gestures of love left unmade. She lived for another 15 years, continuing the work they had started together, writing, teaching, and inspiring others with her example. She never remarried, content with the memories of the great love she had known. When people asked her about her legendary marriage to the Duke of Ashbourne, she would smile and say simply, "He gave me time to find my heart, and when I did, I discovered it had been his all along." When Katherine finally passed at the age of 70, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her last words were of Alexander. "Tell him I'm coming," she whispered with a smile. "Tell him the wait is over." She was buried beside him in the family vault at Ashbourne Manor, their graves side by side just as they had lived their lives. The inscription on their shared monument read simply, "Alexander and Katherine Thornton, Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne." They found love where they least expected it, and built a legacy that will endure forever. And indeed, their legacy did endure. Their children carried forward the lessons they had learned, creating loving marriages of their own. The institutions they had founded continued to serve the community for generations. Katherine's writings remained in print, influencing social policy long after her death. And their story, the tale of a young woman given in marriage to a duke, old enough to be her father who found true love through patience, respect, and unwavering devotion, became a legend whispered by brides and grooms seeking their own happily ever after. It was a reminder that love comes in many forms, that it can grow from the most unlikely beginnings, and that the strongest foundations are built not on passion alone, but on friendship, respect, and the daily choice to cherish one another. Katherine and Alexander's story proved that when two people commit to building something beautiful together, when they approach marriage as a partnership of equals rather than a transaction of convenience, they can create something that transcends time itself. Their love had been unexpected, yes, but it had also been inevitable. Two souls meant to find each other had done so, and in the joining of their lives they had created something greater than either could have achieved alone. And that perhaps is the truest definition of love, the kind that lasts not just for a lifetime, but for eternity. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 2,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.